The rifle was aimed at his chest before he could knock twice. Clara Whitfield had buried one man already. She wouldn't hesitate to put another in the ground if it meant protecting what was hers. But when the stranger stumbled through her doorway that frozen February night, blood staining the snow behind him and death riding hard on his heels, she made a choice that would shatter everything she thought she knew about survival, trust, and the fine line between salvation and ruin. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Colorado Plains had a way of making promises it never intended to keep. Clara Whitfield understood that better than most. She stood at the window of her cabin, watching the blizzard transform the February landscape into something violent and unknowable. Snow didn't just fall here. It attacked. It buried. It erased. She pressed her palm against the frost-covered glass, feeling the cold seep through like a living thing. 3 months. That's how long it had been since they'd lowered Thomas Whitfield into the frozen earth behind the Methodist Church in Redemption Creek. 3 months since the preacher had spoken words about eternal rest to a man who'd never rested a day in his miserable life. 3 months since Clara had stood beside that grave, dry-eyed and hollow, while the town whispered behind gloved hands about the young widow and what would become of her now. What would become of her? As if she were some fragile thing that needed saving. Clara turned from the window, her jaw tight. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a loft, but it was hers. Thomas had built it 15 years ago when they'd first married, back when she'd still believed a man's rough hands could somehow gentle with time, back when she'd confused silence for peace and distance for safety. She'd learned better. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls. Clara moved to the rifle mounted above the mantel, her fingers tracing the cold metal. Thomas had taught her to shoot the week after their wedding, not out of love or concern, but because he'd said a rancher's wife needed to be useful. She'd become more than useful. She'd become necessary. "Miss Clara?" The voice came from the loft, young, uncertain, threaded with the rasp of a developing cough. Noah Carter. 12 years old, orphaned 6 months ago when his father, one of Thomas's ranch hands, had been kicked in the head by a spooked horse. The boy had nowhere else to go, and Clara hadn't had the heart to turn him away. Some might say that made her soft. Those people hadn't seen her face down a pack of coyotes with nothing but a torch and her voice. "I'm here, Noah," she called up. "How's that cough?" Better. It wasn't. She could hear the lie in the way his breath caught between words. Clara climbed the ladder to the loft, her skirts bunching around her knees. Noah lay on his narrow bed, blankets pulled to his chin, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with fever sweat. His eyes, too old for his young face, tracked her movement. "You're burning up," Clara said, pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "When did it get worse?" "Couple hours ago." Noah tried to sit up, but Clara gently pushed him back down. "I didn't want to bother you. You got enough to worry about with the storm and—" "Hush!" She pulled the blankets higher, tucking them around his thin shoulders. "You're not a burden, Noah. Don't ever think that." The boy's eyes glistened and he looked away quickly. Clara pretended not to notice. She knew about pride, knew how it could be the only thing holding a person together when everything else had fallen apart. "I'm going to check on the livestock," she said, standing. "The barn's insulated, but this wind—" She paused as a gust hit the cabin hard enough to rattle the window frames. "I won't be long." "Miss Clara, you shouldn't go out in this. I've been through worse." She'd meant it to sound reassuring, but it came out hard. Factual. The truth had a way of doing that. Downstairs, Clara pulled on Thomas's old coat, still too big in the shoulders, still smelling faintly of tobacco and leather and something sour she'd never been able to name. She wrapped a scarf around her face, loaded the rifle, and stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a fist. Clara bent double, forcing herself forward through snow that was already knee-deep and climbing. The barn was only 30 yards from the cabin, but in a blizzard like this, 30 yards might as well be 30 miles. She kept her head down, one hand on the guide rope Thomas had strung between the buildings, the other clutching the rifle. 15 steps. 20. 25. The cold bit through her coat, through her dress, through her skin. Her lungs burned with each breath. The world had been reduced to white noise and white nothing, and for a moment, just a moment, Clara wondered what it would be like to simply let go of the rope, to let the storm take her, to stop fighting. Then she thought of Noah, alone in that cabin, feverish and afraid, and she kept walking. The barn materialized out of the whiteness like a miracle. Clara stumbled through the door, gasping, and slammed it shut behind her. The sudden absence of wind felt like silence, though she could still hear the storm screaming outside. Inside, the barn was dark and cold, but mercifully still. The three remaining horses, Juniper, Ash, and the old mare, Patience, stood in their stalls, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The two milk cows, Bess and Molly, shifted restlessly near the back. All of them alive. All of them safe. For now. Clara set down the rifle and grabbed a pitchfork, spreading fresh hay in each stall. Her hands shook. From cold or exhaustion, she couldn't tell anymore. When had she last slept? Really slept? Not the fitful half-consciousness that passed for rest these days, but actual dreamless sleep? She couldn't remember. "Easy, girl," she murmured to Juniper, running her hand along the mare's neck. The horse nickered softly, leaning into her touch. Animals were simpler than people. They didn't lie, didn't make promises they had no intention of keeping. They were honest in their needs and their fears. Clara wished people could be the same. She was checking the water trough, frozen solid as she'd feared, when she heard it. A sound, not the wind, not the creak of old wood or the shuffle of hooves. A knock. Clara went still, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she'd left by the door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one traveled in weather like this. No one sane, anyway. Redemption Creek was 8 miles away, and the nearest neighbor, the Hendersons, had packed up and headed east before the first snow. She was alone out here. Supposed to be alone. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent. Not on the barn door, on the cabin door. Clara grabbed the rifle and ran. The journey back was worse. The wind had picked up, screaming like something alive and furious. Snow pelted her face, stinging her eyes, getting into her mouth and nose with every gasping breath. She lost the guide rope twice and had to backtrack, panic clawing at her throat. By the time she reached the cabin, her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. She burst through the door, rifle raised, and found Noah at the top of the ladder, his face pale. "Someone's outside," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I know." Clara crossed to the window, peering out into the white chaos. "Get back in bed, Noah." "But now." The boy disappeared into the loft without another word. Clara moved to the door, her finger resting on the trigger. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 10 years old, back in Missouri before the cholera took him. He'd said a gun was only as dangerous as the person holding it, and that a scared person was the most dangerous kind. Clara wasn't scared. She was prepared. "Who's there?" she shouted over the wind. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, "My name's Silas Rourke." The voice was deep, rough, strained with cold and exhaustion. "I need shelter, just for the night. My horse is—" A pause, a sound that might have been a curse or a prayer. "Please." Clara's grip tightened on the rifle. She'd heard enough desperation in her life to recognize the real thing. But desperation and danger often walked hand in hand. "How many are you?" she called. "Just me." "You armed?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, ma'am." At least he was honest. Clara closed her eyes, weighing her options. Send him away, and she'd likely be sending him to his death. Let him in, and she might be inviting her own. The smart choice was clear. But smart choices had a way of feeling wrong when you were the one making them. "The barn's unlocked," she finally said. "You can shelter there. There's hay, and the animals will keep it warmer than nothing. But you come near this cabin before morning, and I'll shoot you. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." The voice faded into the storm. Clara waited, rifle still raised, listening. She heard the creak of the barn door opening, closing, then nothing but wind. She lowered the rifle, her hands trembling now for an entirely different reason. "Is he gone?" Noah called from the loft. "He's in the barn." Clara set the rifle down and moved to the fire, holding her frozen hands toward the flames. "He'll stay there till morning." What if he doesn't? It was a good question, a smart question, the kind of question that came from a boy who'd learned too young that the world wasn't safe. Then I'll handle it, Claire said simply. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the fire, the rifle across her lap, listening to the storm rage and Noah's labored breathing from above. Every sound made her tense, every creak, every gust, every whisper of wind against wood. She kept seeing the door, imagining it bursting open, imagining the stranger silhouetted against the snow, imagining violence. It was what she'd learned to expect from men. Thomas had taught her that lesson well. Not with his fists, he'd been too careful for that, too aware of appearances, but with his coldness, his casual cruelties, the way he'd looked at her sometimes, like she was something he'd purchased and found disappointing. She'd buried those memories with him, or tried to. Dawn came slowly, the darkness grudgingly giving way to a sullen gray light. The storm had eased but not broken. Snow still fell, thick and heavy, blanketing everything in white. Clara stood stiffly, her back aching from the night in the chair, and moved to the window. The barn looked the same. No footprints leading to the cabin. No signs of movement. Maybe he'd frozen in the night. It wouldn't be the first time. Clara checked on Noah, still feverish, still coughing, but alive, and pulled on Thomas's coat. She grabbed the rifle and stepped outside. The cold hit her like a wall. The world was nothing but white. White ground, white sky, white air, thick with falling snow. Clara made her way to the barn, each step an effort, the guide rope her only anchor in the whiteout. Inside, the barn was silent. Too silent. Clara raised the rifle, her heart pounding. Rourke? Movement from the shadows. A figure unfolding from the hay near Patience's stall. Massive, broad-shouldered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to seem threatening. Silas Rourke was the biggest man Clara had ever seen. Not just tall, though he had to be well over 6 feet, but built like something carved from stone. Broad chest, thick arms, hands that looked like they could break a man in half without trying. His coat was worn, patched in places, dusted with snow. Dark hair fell past his collar, and several days' worth of beard shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray, steady, careful. The eyes of a man who knew what he looked like and had learned to move accordingly. "Ma'am." He kept his hands visible, away from his sides. "I'm grateful for the shelter." Clara kept the rifle trained on his chest. "Where's your horse?" Something flickered across his face. Grief, quick and raw. "Dead. Collapsed about 20 yards from your barn. I tried to save her, but..." He stopped, his jaw working. "She gave everything she had to get me here." Clara studied him. His voice matched his size, deep, resonant, but somehow gentle, like thunder rolling in from a distance. His clothes were travel-worn but clean, no blood, no obvious weapons, though she didn't doubt he was carrying. He'd said he was armed. "You have a name besides Rourke?" she asked. "Silas." He met her gaze steadily. "Silas Rourke, out of New Mexico territory. Been traveling north for 2 weeks now. Got caught in the storm about 15 miles south of here yesterday evening. Long way from New Mexico." "Yes, ma'am." "What brings you to Colorado in the dead of winter?" His expression didn't change, but something shifted in those gray eyes. Something Clara recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror often enough. He was running from something. "Looking for work," Silas said. "Heard there were ranches up this way that might need hands come spring." It wasn't a lie exactly, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Clara lowered the rifle slightly, not all the way, but enough to show she wasn't planning to shoot him immediately. "Storm like this might last another day or two, maybe more. You're welcome to the barn till it passes. There's hay and I can bring you some food, but when the weather clears, you move on. Clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. Makes me feel old." She turned toward the door. "Name's Clara, Clara Whitfield." "Mrs. Whitfield." "Just Clara." She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. "The boy, I heard him coughing last night. Is he all right?" Clara turned back slowly, her hand tightening on the rifle. "What boy?" Silas didn't flinch. "The one in your cabin. Young, by the sound of it. That cough, it's deep. Sounds like it might be settling in his chest. My mother used to make a tea, elderberry and honey with a bit of pine resin. Helped clear the lungs. If you have the ingredients, I can manage." Claire's voice came out harder than she'd intended. "You worry about staying warm. I'll worry about Noah." She left before he could respond, stepping back into the white world outside. But as she made her way to the cabin, she couldn't shake the memory of his expression when he'd asked about Noah. There'd been genuine concern there. Not the polite interest of a stranger making conversation, but real worry, like he actually cared. It unsettled her more than his size or his obvious strength. Back in the cabin, Clara found Noah awake, sitting up in bed with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with fever. "Who is he?" the boy asked immediately. "Says his name's Silas Rourke. Traveler. Horse died in the storm." Clara set down the rifle and moved to the small stove, starting water for tea. "He'll be gone when the weather clears." "Is he dangerous?" Clara paused, considering. "I don't know yet." It was the most honest answer she could give. The day passed slowly. Clara moved between the cabin and the barn, checking on the animals, bringing Silas food, dried venison, hard bread, coffee that was more grounds than water. He accepted it with quiet thanks, never asking for more, never complaining. When she mentioned Noah's cough, he described the tea recipe in detail, carefully, like he was afraid she might take offense at the suggestion. She didn't. That night, she tried the recipe. Elderberry from her stores, honey from the Hendersons' hives before they'd left, pine resin scraped from the old tree near the well. The resulting tea was bitter and strange smelling, but Noah drank it without complaint. Within an hour, his cough had eased. By morning, his fever had broken. Clara stood at the window watching the snow fall and wondered what kind of man carried his mother's remedies in his head like treasures. The kind who'd lost her, probably. The kind who remembered. The storm didn't break on the second day, or the third. By the fourth day, Clara had fallen into an uneasy rhythm. She'd check on Noah, tend the fire, then make the trek to the barn to feed Silas and check the animals. He never asked to come inside, never pushed. He seemed content, or at least resigned, to his exile in the cold. But on the morning of the fifth day, everything changed. Clara woke to silence, complete, absolute silence. No wind, no snow battering the windows, no storm scream tearing at the walls. She sat up quickly, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't name. Through the window she could see blue sky, actual blue sky, for the first time in nearly a week. The world was buried under 4 feet of snow, pristine and blinding white in the early sun. But the storm had finally, mercifully, passed. "Noah?" she called up to the loft. "I see it!" The boy's voice was stronger, clearer. The cough was gone. "The storm stopped!" Clara dressed quickly and stepped outside. The cold was different now, sharp and clean instead of violent. The air felt like glass in her lungs. She could see for miles across the white plains, all the way to the distant mountains that marked the western horizon. It was beautiful. It was also deadly. 4 feet of snow meant the animals were trapped, meant the barn roof might collapse under the weight, meant she had maybe a day, 2 if she was lucky, before the livestock started dying. She needed help. She needed Silas Rourke. Clara made her way to the barn, expecting to find him preparing to leave. Instead, she found him already working. He'd somehow made it outside without her hearing. Massive footprints led from the barn to the fence line, where he was using a shovel to clear snow from around the water trough. His coat was off despite the cold, hung on a fence post, and she could see the muscles in his back and shoulders working as he dug. He moved with the steady, patient rhythm of someone who'd done hard labor his entire life. "You're still here," Clara said. Silas looked up, not startled, like he'd known she was there all along. "Storm's over. Figured you could use a hand before I left." He gestured to the barn roof. "That's carrying a lot of weight. Might need to be cleared before it comes down on your animals." Clara followed his gaze. He was right. The roof was sagging in the middle, snow piled nearly 3 feet high. "I can manage," she said automatically. Silas nodded slowly, then went back to shoveling. "Yes, ma'am, I expect you can. But managing alone and managing with help are 2 different things. One of them's just harder on your back." It was such a simple statement, delivered without judgment or expectation, that Clara didn't know how to argue with it. So she didn't. "Fine," she said. "Clear the roof. I'll start on the path to the cabin." They worked in silence for the next hour. Silas climbed onto the barn roof, moving carefully, testing each step, and began pushing snow off in controlled avalanches. Clara shoveled a path from the barn to the cabin, her shoulders burning, her hands blistering inside her gloves. She was halfway through when she heard the crash. Clara spun around, her heart in her throat, and saw Silas on the ground beside the barn. He must have slipped, fallen 15 feet onto the hard-packed snow below. She ran. "Rourke!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his chest, afraid to touch, afraid not to. "Are you—" "I'm fine." He sat up slowly, wincing. "Just knocked the wind out of myself." "You fell off a roof." "Not the first time." He rotated his shoulder carefully, testing. "Nothing broken. I've had worse." "That's not—" Clara stopped, frustrated. "You could have been killed." Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Would have been my own fault. I got careless." "Why are you doing this?" The question burst out before she could stop it. "Why are you helping me? You could have left this morning. You don't owe me anything." He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes steady on hers. Then, "My mother used to say that kindness is a debt we owe to strangers. You gave me shelter when you didn't have to. Could have left me to freeze. Didn't. I gave you a barn. You gave me my life." He stood slowly, brushing snow from his clothes. "Figured the least I could do was make sure your roof didn't collapse before I left." Clara stood too, her mind racing. She should send him away. That had been the deal, shelter till the storm passed. Then he was gone. It was safer that way, simpler. But Noah's fever had broken because of his tea. The barn roof would have collapsed if he hadn't cleared it. And despite everything she'd learned about men, about trusting, about the cost of letting someone close, she didn't want him to leave. Not yet. "The fence is broken," she heard herself say. "North pasture. Came down in the storm. If the cattle get through before I can fix it—" She stopped, making herself meet his gaze. "I could use help. A few more days. I can't pay you, but there's food and a warm place to sleep." Silas studied her face, and Clara had the uncomfortable feeling he could see straight through her, could see the fear and the hope warring inside her chest. "The barn's warm enough," he said finally, "and I don't need pay, but I'll need to head into town soon. Pick up supplies if I'm staying longer. Town's 8 miles, road's probably buried." "I've walked through worse." Clara nodded slowly, something loosening in her chest. "All right. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Silas said, a ghost of a smile crossing his face. "You haven't seen me try to fix a fence." It was such an unexpected thing to say, so completely normal, that Clara almost laughed. Almost. That afternoon, Noah met Silas Rourke. Clara had tried to keep them separated, some protective instinct making her want to shield the boy from this stranger. But Noah had other ideas. He appeared in the barn doorway while Silas was feeding the horses, bundled in every piece of clothing he owned, his eyes wide and curious. "You're the man from the storm," Noah said. Silas turned slowly, making himself smaller somehow, less threatening. "That's me. You must be Noah. How'd you know my name?" "Miss Clara mentioned you, said you'd been sick." Silas gestured to the barn's interior. "You feeling better?" "Yeah." Noah stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over Silas with the frank assessment of childhood. "You're really big." "Noah!" Clara appeared behind him, her face flushing. "That's rude." "It's all right." Silas smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. "He's not wrong. I am really big. Got it from my father. He was built like an ox, mean as one too, when he wanted to be." Noah moved closer, fascinated. "Are you mean?" "Noah, only when I need to be," Silas said seriously. "Which isn't often. Being mean takes a lot of energy. I'd rather spend it on other things." "Like what?" "Like fixing fences, or teaching curious boys how to properly care for horses." Silas glanced at Clara. "If that's all right with Miss Clara." Clara wanted to say no. wanted to pull Noah back to the cabin, back to safety. But the boy was looking at Silas with something she hadn't seen in his face since his father died. Interest, engagement, life. "All right," she said quietly, "but stay where I can see you." She watched as Silas showed Noah how to brush down Juniper, his large hands gentle on the mare's coat, his voice patient as he explained each step. The boy listened with complete attention, asking questions, laughing when Juniper nickered and nudged his shoulder. And Silas, this massive, dangerous-looking stranger, knelt in the hay to get to Noah's level, making himself small for a child's comfort. Clara felt something crack in her chest, something she'd thought was long dead. That night, after Noah had gone to bed, Clara sat by the fire and tried to make sense of what she was feeling. It wasn't attraction, or at least she didn't think it was. She'd learned not to trust that particular emotion, learned how it could twist into something ugly. But there was something about the way Silas moved through the world. Careful, deliberate, like he was always aware of his own strength and the damage it could do. Like he'd decided consciously to be gentle. She'd never known a man who made that choice. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work. Silas repaired the fence, not just patched it, but rebuilt the entire section, stronger than before. He cleared paths through the snow, reinforced the barn's support beams, even fixed the leaking roof of the cabin that Clara had been ignoring for months. He worked from dawn until dusk, breaking only to eat the simple meals Clara brought him. He never complained, never asked for anything beyond what she offered. And every evening, without fail, he spent an hour with Noah, teaching him about horses and woodworking and a dozen other things the boy soaked up like sunlight. Clara found herself watching them, found herself listening to Noah's laughter, real laughter, the kind that came from joy instead of politeness, found herself wondering what it would be like if this wasn't temporary. On the 4th day, Silas announced he needed to go to town. "Supplies?" Clara asked, though she knew it was more than that. He'd been stretching his rations, making the food she provided last longer than it should. He needed to resupply properly if he was going to stay. "And to introduce myself to the sheriff," Silas said. "Strange man shows up in a small town, starts working at a widow's ranch. People talk. Better to get ahead of it." Clara's stomach tightened. "What will you tell him?" "The truth. That I'm passing through, that you hired me to help with winter repairs, and that I'll be moving on come spring." His eyes met hers. "Unless you'd rather I say something different." Would she? Clara didn't know. Didn't know what she wanted anymore, except that the thought of him leaving made her chest ache in ways she didn't want to examine. "The truth is fine," she said. Silas left at dawn, walking through the snow-buried landscape toward Redemption Creek. Clara watched him go, then turned back to the cabin and found Noah standing beside her. "He's coming back, right?" the boy asked. "He said he would." "But what if he doesn't? What if he gets to town and decides to just keep going?" Clara looked down at Noah's worried face and saw her own fear reflected there. "Then we'll manage," she said. "We always do." But as the day wore on and the sun began to set, Clara found herself at the window more and more often, watching the eastern horizon for signs of movement, watching for him. He returned at dusk, carrying supplies and wearing an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "How was town?" she asked as he unpacked. Flour, salt, coffee, sugar, and a small bag of peppermint sticks that he handed to Noah with a wink. "Interesting," Silas said. "Met the sheriff. Cole Mercer. Seems like a good man. Asked a lot of questions." Clara's heart sank. "What kind of questions?" "The careful kind. Wanted to know where I came from, where I was headed, what my business was with you." Silas met her gaze. "I told him the truth. Mostly." "Mostly?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are things in my past, Clara. Things I'm not proud of. I haven't lied to you, but I haven't told you everything either. If that's a problem." "Everyone has a past," Clara interrupted. "I'm not asking you to confess yours." "Maybe you should." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Clara wanted to ask, wanted to know what shadows he was carrying, but she also knew that once certain doors were opened, they couldn't be closed again. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. "Did the sheriff have any other news?" she asked instead. Silas's expression darkened. He mentioned there's been some trouble with land claims. Man named Victor Hale's been buying up properties around the territory, offering low prices, using legal pressure when people won't sell. He's particularly interested in land with water rights. Clara went still. Water rights? Like mine. Like yours. They looked at each other, and Clara saw understanding dawn in Silas's eyes at the same moment it hit her. She wasn't safe here. She'd never been safe. The wolves were circling, and the storm, the real storm, was just beginning. The name Victor Hale settled over the cabin like frost. Clara moved to the window, her arms wrapped tight around herself, staring out at the snow-covered plains that stretched endlessly in every direction. Water rights. Thomas had never mentioned water rights. He'd barely mentioned anything about the ranch's legal standing, always waving off her questions with irritation and whiskey breath. "How much do you know about your husband's business dealings?" Silas asked carefully, breaking the silence. "Not enough." Clara's voice was flat. "Thomas didn't believe in sharing that kind of information with his wife, said it wasn't my concern. And now? Now it's all my concern." She turned to face him. "What else did the sheriff say?" Silas set down the supplies, his movements deliberate. He said Hale's been working this territory for about 2 years. Buys land cheap, consolidates properties, then sells to railroad companies or mining operations at a profit. He's not breaking any laws, technically, but there have been complaints, pressure tactics, mysterious fires, livestock disappearing. And people just sell to him? Most don't have a choice. Hale finds debts they didn't know they had. Tax liens, disputed property lines. He's got lawyers, Clara. Good ones. The kind that can make a piece of paper say whatever they need it to say. Clara's hands clenched at her sides. Thomas wouldn't have borrowed money from someone like that. "Are you certain?" The question hit harder than it should have. No, she wasn't certain. Thomas had kept secrets the way other men kept livestock, carefully penned, never allowed to roam free. She'd learned to stop asking questions years ago, learned that curiosity was rewarded with cold silences and colder shoulders. "I need to see the property documents," she said. "Everything Thomas left. If there's debt attached to this land, I need to know." Silas nodded. "Where would he have kept them?" "There's a lockbox in the bedroom." Clara headed for the ladder leading to the loft, then paused. "Noah, you stay down here with Silas. But Miss Clara, stay here." She climbed quickly, her heart pounding. The bedroom, her bedroom, though she'd never think of it that way, was small and spare. A bed with a thin mattress, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a trunk at the foot of the bed containing Thomas's remaining possessions, the things she hadn't been able to bring herself to burn or bury. The lockbox was at the bottom of the trunk, heavy and cold. Clara had the key on a chain around her neck, had worn it every day since Thomas died without knowing exactly why. Insurance, maybe. Or just the stubborn need to hold on to something, even if that something was just metal and secrets. She carried the box downstairs. Silas and Noah were sitting at the small table, the boys' attention fixed on a piece of wood Silas was carving with a pocket knife. Smooth, careful strokes that sent thin curls of pine spiraling to the floor. Clara set the box down with a heavy thunk. "You don't have to do this now," Silas said quietly. "Could wait until morning." "No." Clara inserted the key, her hand steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. "I'm tired of not knowing." The lock clicked open. Inside were papers, dozens of them, some official-looking with seals and signatures, others just handwritten notes in Thomas's tight, controlled script. Clara spread them across the table, her eyes scanning quickly. Deed to the property, marriage certificate, bill of sale for the original livestock, correspondence with the land office in Denver. Everything seemed in order, exactly what she'd expected to find. Then Silas reached past her and pulled out a folded document from the bottom of the box. "What's this?" Clara took it, unfolding stiff paper that crackled with age. Her eyes moved over the words, once, twice, 3 times, trying to make sense of what she was reading. Partnership agreement. Between Thomas Whitfield and Victor Hale. Dated 4 years ago. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not—" "Clara." Silas's voice was gentle but firm. "What does it say?" She forced herself to read it aloud, her voice mechanical. Thomas Whitfield and Victor Hale hereby enter into partnership for the purpose of acquiring and consolidating property rights in the Colorado Territory. Initial investment from Hale, $5,000. Whitfield to provide local knowledge and property access. Profits to be split equally upon sale of consolidated holdings. The paper trembled in her hands. "There's more," Silas said, pointing to a clause near the bottom. Clara read it silently this time. In the event of Whitfield's death, all partnership assets and agreements transfer to Hale, including any property held in Whitfield's name at time of death. The world tilted. "He sold me," Clara said distantly. "Thomas sold the ranch, sold everything, and when he died, it became Hale's." Silas finished the sentence she couldn't. Noah's voice cut through the ringing in her ears. "What does that mean? Does she have to leave?" "No." The word came out hard, sharp as broken glass. Clara set down the document, her hands curling into fists. "No, I'm not leaving. This is my home. I've bled into this land, worked it, kept it alive while Thomas drank himself to death. Some piece of paper doesn't change that." "Legally," Silas began. "I don't care about legally." Clara looked at him, her eyes blazing. "I care about what's right. And this," she gestured at the document, "this isn't right. Thomas had no right to make deals with my life, with my home." "I'm not disagreeing with you," Silas said carefully, "but Hale will have lawyers, and if this document is legitimate, then I'll fight it." "With what? You said yourself you can't pay me. How are you going to pay a lawyer?" The question deflated her anger like a punctured water skin. He was right. She had nothing. No money, no allies, no leverage. Just a small ranch on the Colorado plains and the stubborn refusal to give it up. It wouldn't be enough. Silas stood slowly, moving to the window. For a long moment he just looked out at the darkening landscape, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the last of the daylight. "There might be another way," he said finally. "What way?" He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Documents can be challenged, especially if there's evidence they were obtained through fraud or coercion. If we could prove that Thomas was pressured into this agreement or that he didn't understand what he was signing—" "Thomas understood everything," Clara said bitterly. "He was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them." "Then we need to find something else, something that proves this partnership was illegal or that Hale violated its terms." Silas moved back to the table, gathering the papers. "May I?" Clara nodded, too numb to object. She watched as Silas sorted through the documents with surprising care, his thick fingers handling the fragile paper gently. He read slowly, his lips moving slightly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Here," he said after several minutes. "Look at this." He held up another letter, this one newer, dated just 2 months before Thomas died. Clara took it, recognizing the letterhead immediately, a law office in Denver. "Dear Mr. Whitfield," she read aloud, "this letter serves as formal notice that your partnership agreement with Mr. Victor Hale is in violation of territorial water rights regulations, specifically Section 4 of the Land and Water Act of 1871. Any attempt to transfer or consolidate water rights without proper filing and public notice is null and void under territorial law." Clara looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means," Silas said, something like satisfaction creeping into his voice, "that even if the partnership was legal, they couldn't transfer your water rights without going through proper channels. Public notice, county approval. And I'm willing to bet Hale never filed those papers." "Why wouldn't he?" "Because public notice means public scrutiny, means people asking questions about why a widow's losing her land, means attention he doesn't want." Silas tapped the letter. "This is leverage, Clara. Not much, but something." Hope flickered in her chest, fragile as candlelight. "Enough to fight him?" "Maybe, if we're smart about it." He paused. "But you should know, men like Hale don't lose gracefully. If we challenge him, he'll push back. Hard." "Let him push." Clara's voice was steel. "I'm done running, done being afraid." Silas studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, then we need a plan." They worked late into the night, the three of them, Clara, Silas, and even Noah, who refused to be sent to bed, piecing together a strategy. Silas would return to town in the morning, talk to Sheriff Mercer, see what the man knew about Hale's operations. Clara would search through the rest of Thomas's papers, looking for anything else that might help. And Noah would keep watch, the boy volunteering with such fierce determination that neither adult had the heart to refuse him. It was past midnight when Silas finally stood to leave. "Barn's getting cold," he said. "I should let you rest." "Wait." Clara moved to the stove, wrapping a cloth around the handle of the kettle. "Take this. It'll stay warm for a few hours at least." Their fingers brushed as he took it, and Clara felt something electric in the contact. She pulled back quickly, too quickly, and saw understanding flash in Silas's eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for trusting me with this." "You gave me a choice." Clara met his gaze. "Not many men do that." "Then you've known the wrong kind of men." It was such a simple statement, delivered without judgment or pity, that it took Clara's breath away. Because he was right. She had known the wrong kind of men. Her father, cold and distant. Thomas, cruel in his indifference. Even the men in town who looked at her now with either lust or pity, never just seeing her. But Silas looked at her like she was a person, capable, strong, worth listening to. It was terrifying. "Good night, Silas," she said. "Good night, Clara." He left quietly, the door closing with barely a sound. Clara stood in the silence, her heart beating too fast, her skin still tingling where their hands had touched. "You like him," Noah said from behind her. Clara spun around. The boy was sitting on the bottom rung of the ladder, his expression knowing beyond his years. "I barely know him," Clara said. "That's not what I asked." Clara sighed, sinking into the chair beside the fire. "Go to bed, Noah." "Do you think he'll stay? After we deal with Mr. Hale?" The question hit her square in the chest. Would he? Silas had made it clear he was just passing through, that spring would see him moving on. This was temporary, all of it. The help, the kindness, the way her heart jumped when he smiled at something Noah said. Temporary. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "He's got his own path to walk. Maybe his path goes through here." Noah stood, moving toward the ladder. Maybe he just doesn't know it yet. Clara watched the boy disappear into the loft, his words echoing in the quiet cabin. Maybe. But maybe wasn't enough to build a life on. Morning came too soon. Clara woke to the sound of hammering, steady, rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside. She dressed quickly and stepped into the pale dawn light to find Silas reinforcing the fence around the chicken coop, his breath steaming in the cold air. "You're up early," she called. "Couldn't sleep." He didn't look up from his work. "Figured I might as well be useful." Clara moved closer, watching the way he worked, efficient, precise, wasting no motion. "When do you leave for town?" "After breakfast. Wanted to make sure everything here was secure first." Something in his tone made her pause. Secure from what? Silas set down the hammer, finally meeting her eyes. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night. About Hale. If he's been watching this property, waiting for the right moment to make his move, you think he knows Thomas is dead." "I think he's known for 3 months, and I think he's been waiting for you to get desperate enough to accept whatever offer he makes. Then he's going to be disappointed. He's going to be angry." Silas's expression was serious. "Angry men do stupid things, Clara. Dangerous things. I don't want to leave you and Noah alone if... We'll be fine. We've been alone for 3 months already." That was before you knew what you were up against. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist she didn't need protecting. But the truth was, she was afraid. Not of being alone. She'd learned to live with that fear years ago. But of what Hale might do when he realized she wasn't going to roll over and surrender. "How long will you be gone?" she asked instead. "Few hours. I'll talk to the sheriff, see what I can learn, then come straight back." He picked up the hammer again. "Lock the door while I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone except me or Mercer. Understood? I've got the rifle." "I know. Use it if you have to." His eyes held hers. "I mean that, Clara. If someone comes around making trouble, you protect yourself and Noah first. Worry about the consequences later." The intensity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "You sound like you're expecting trouble." "I'm always expecting trouble." He turned back to the fence. Keeps me alive. An hour later, Clara watched Silas disappear down the snow-packed road toward Redemption Creek, his figure growing smaller until the landscape swallowed him whole. She stood at the window long after he'd vanished, her arms wrapped around herself, fighting the urge to call him back. "Miss Clara?" Noah appeared at her elbow. "Want me to gather the eggs?" "Yes, but stay close to the cabin. And Noah..." She waited until he looked at her. "If you see anyone coming, anyone at all, you get inside immediately. Don't wait, don't ask questions, just run." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded seriously. "Yes, ma'am." Clara spent the morning searching through the rest of Thomas's papers, looking for anything that might help their case. She found evidence of debts she'd never known about. Money owed to merchants in Denver, outstanding tabs at saloons, even a loan from a bank in Colorado Springs. Thomas had been drowning financially, she realized. Desperate. No wonder he'd partnered with Hale, but desperation didn't excuse betrayal. She was deep in a pile of invoices when she heard it, the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses. Clara's blood went cold. She moved to the window, her hand already reaching for the rifle. 3 riders were coming up the road, moving at an easy pace, like men who had all the time in the world, like men who knew exactly where they were going. The one in front was dressed too fine for ranch country. Tailored coat, polished boots, a hat that probably cost more than Clara made in a year. Even from a distance, she could see the confidence in his posture, the casual arrogance of someone used to getting what he wanted. Victor Hale had come calling. "Noah!" Clara's voice came out sharp. "Inside. Now." The boy appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "Who is it?" "Trouble. Get upstairs. Don't come down no matter what you hear." "But, now Noah!" He ran. Clara heard his footsteps on the ladder, the creak of the loft floor. Then silence. She positioned herself at the window, rifle loaded and ready, as the riders drew closer. Hale dismounted with practiced ease, handing his reins to one of his men, hired muscle, from the look of them. Big, hard-faced, wearing guns like jewelry. Hale approached the cabin alone, his smile visible even through the dirty glass. He knocked politely. Clara didn't move. "Mrs. Whitfield?" His voice was smooth, educated, utterly reasonable. "My name is Victor Hale. I believe we have business to discuss." "We have no business," Clara called back. "Ah, but we do. Your late husband and I were partners. Surely he mentioned our arrangement?" "He didn't. How unfortunate." A pause. "Might I come in? This conversation would be more pleasant conducted in comfort." "You can say what you need to say from out there." She heard him sigh, a theatrical sound meant to convey patience wearing thin. "Very well. I'll be direct. Your husband entered into a legal partnership with me 4 years ago. That partnership included this property and its associated water rights. Upon his death, those assets transferred to my ownership. I've come to discuss the terms of your departure." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'm not going anywhere." "Mrs. Whitfield, I understand this is difficult. Losing a husband, facing an uncertain future, it's natural to feel overwhelmed. But the law is quite clear on this matter. The property belongs to me now. However, I'm not an unreasonable man. I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your trouble. $500 and safe passage to wherever you'd like to go." "No." "I'm sorry?" "I said no." Clara moved to the door, standing where he could see her through the gap. The rifle was clearly visible in her hands. "This is my home, my land. Whatever arrangement you had with Thomas died with him." Hale's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not how the law works. I have documentation that violates territorial water rights regulations." Clara saw his expression shift, just slightly. "That's right, Mr. Hale. I found your little partnership agreement, and I found the letter from the law office in Denver explaining exactly why your claim is invalid." The smile disappeared completely now. "You've been speaking to lawyers," Hale said softly. "I've been speaking to people who know the law, which is more than you can say." "I see." He took a step back, his gaze sweeping over the cabin, the barn, the snow-covered fields beyond. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Whitfield. A serious mistake. I've invested considerable resources in acquiring the properties in this region. I don't intend to let one stubborn widow derail years of work." Then I guess you'll have to adjust your plans. Hale studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked back to his horse, moving with unhurried confidence. He mounted smoothly, gathering the reins. I'll give you 1 week to reconsider, he called. 1 week to accept my generous offer and leave peacefully. After that, he shrugged. Well, accidents happen on these isolated ranches. Fires, roof collapses, animals spooked in the night. It would be tragic if something happened to you, or to that boy you've taken in. Clara raised the rifle to her shoulder. You threaten Noah again, and I'll put a bullet through your skull before you clear my property line. Hale's laugh was genuine. I believe you would. But you're one woman, Mrs. Whitfield, and I'm a patient man. He tipped his hat mockingly. 1 week. Think carefully. He rode away, his men flanking him, leaving nothing but hoofprints in the snow and a sick feeling in Clara's stomach. She stood at the door for long minutes after they'd gone, her heart hammering, her hands shaking so badly she had to set down the rifle before she dropped it. Miss Clara? Noah's voice drifted down from the loft, small and scared. You can come down now. The boy descended quickly, throwing his arms around her waist. Clara held him tight, feeling him tremble. What are we going to do? He whispered. Fight, Clara said. We're going to fight. But even as she said it, she wondered if fighting would be enough. Silas returned 3 hours later, his face grim. He took one look at Clara's expression and went still. What happened? She told him everything, Hale's visit, his threats, the 1 week deadline. Silas listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with each word. He threatened Noah, Silas said when she finished. It wasn't a question. Yes, something dangerous flashed in those gray eyes. Where's the boy now? Upstairs, resting. Silas nodded slowly, then moved to the table, his movements controlled but tense. I spoke with Sheriff Mercer. He knows about Hale's operations, has been watching him for months. But Hale's careful, never breaks the law in ways that can be proven. The fires, the accidents, the pressure, it's all just circumstantial. Nothing that would hold up in court. So he can do whatever he wants. Not whatever. Mercer's a good man and he's suspicious, but he needs evidence, something concrete that ties Hale to illegal activity. Clara sank into a chair, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming. We don't have a week to gather evidence. No. Silas was quiet for a moment. But we might not need it. What do you mean? He pulled something from his coat pocket, a folded newspaper, several days old. I picked this up in town, page 3, bottom article. Clara unfolded it, scanning quickly. Her breath caught. The headline read, Land Speculator Under Investigation in New Mexico Territory. The article detailed allegations against a Victor Hale, same name, possibly the same man, for fraud and intimidation in a similar land consolidation scheme. Witnesses had come forward. Evidence had been gathered. Charges were pending. Is this the same Hale? Clara asked. Mercer thinks so. The description matches, and the methods are identical. If it is, and if those charges stick, then anything he's done here becomes suspect too. Clara felt hope surge through her. We can use this. Show it to a judge. Prove he's got a pattern of illegal behavior. Maybe, but it's not proof of what he's doing on your land specifically. Silas met her eyes. And it might make him more dangerous. If he thinks his whole operation is about to collapse, he's got nothing to lose. So what do? We prepare. We gather what evidence we can. We make it clear we're not backing down. He paused. And we make sure you and Noah are never alone. Not until this is resolved. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle herself. But the memory of Hale's cold smile, his casual threats, the way his men had looked at her cabin like they were already planning its destruction. All right, she said quietly. But Silas, you need to know. If this gets dangerous, if Hale decides to escalate, I know what I'm signing up for. His voice was firm. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Why? The question burst out before she could stop it. Why are you doing this? You could leave right now. Walk away. This isn't your fight. Silas was silent for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I told you I was running from something. That's true. But what I didn't say is what I was running toward. He looked at her, his gray eyes steady and serious. I've spent most of my life being what other people expected. Big, strong, useful for violence. And for a long time, I let them use me that way. Did things I'm not proud of. Hurt people who didn't deserve it. He stood, moving to the window, his broad back to her. Then, one day I woke up and realized I didn't recognize the man in the mirror anymore. So I left. Started walking, told myself I'd keep walking until I found a place where I could be something different, someone better. He turned back to her. Maybe this is that place. Maybe helping you fight this is my chance to use these hands for building instead of breaking. Clara's throat tightened. That's a lot to put on one small ranch. It's not about the ranch. His gaze held hers. It's about the woman willing to fight for it. About a boy who deserves to grow up somewhere safe. About doing one right thing after so many wrong ones. She stood slowly, crossing to where he stood. Up close, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She could see the scars on his face now, small ones mostly, the kind that came from hard living and harder lessons. Could see the weariness that lived behind his steady gaze. Could see the man he was trying to become. 1 week, she said softly. We have 1 week to figure out how to stop him. Then we'd better get started. They spent the next 2 days turning the cabin into something resembling a fortress. Silas reinforced the door with extra boards, checked every window for weak points, and positioned supplies where they could be reached quickly in an emergency. Clara cleaned and loaded every gun on the property, the rifle, Thomas's old pistol, even the rusty shotgun she'd found in the barn. Noah, despite his protests, was assigned to watch duty, positioned in the loft where he could see the road in both directions. It felt like preparing for war. Maybe it was. On the third morning, Silas left for town again, this time with a specific purpose. Sheriff Mercer had sent word that he'd received correspondence from New Mexico territory, official documents related to the investigation into Victor Hale's activities there. If they could prove the Colorado Hale and the New Mexico Hale were the same man, it might give them leverage. Clara watched him go with growing unease. The sky had that peculiar quality it got before a storm, heavy and gray, pressing down on the world like a threat. But it wasn't snow she feared anymore. She was cleaning the breakfast dishes when Noah called down from the loft. "Miss Clara, someone's coming!" Her heart jumped. Clara dried her hands quickly, reaching for the rifle. "How many?" "Just one. On horseback. Moving slow." Not Hale, then. He traveled with his hired muscle. Clara moved to the window, squinting against the glare of sun on snow. The rider was still distant, but something about the figure seemed familiar. As they drew closer, Clara recognized the horse first, a paint mare she'd seen hitched outside the general store in Redemption Creek. Then the rider's face came into focus, and Clara's grip on the rifle loosened slightly. Margaret Chen, the town seamstress and one of the few people who'd shown Clara genuine kindness after Thomas died. Clara opened the door as Margaret dismounted, her movement stiff from the cold ride. "Margaret, what are you doing out here?" The older woman's face was grave. "I came to warn you. May I come in?" Clara stepped aside, ushering her into the warmth. Margaret's cheeks were red from wind, her breath coming in short gasps. Clara poured her coffee while the woman gathered herself. "There's talk in town," Margaret said finally, wrapping her hands around the cup. "About you and Victor Hale. About the ranch." "What kind of talk?" "The dangerous kind." Margaret's dark eyes were serious. "Hale's been buying drinks at the saloon, telling anyone who'll listen that you're mentally unstable. That grief over Thomas's death has made you irrational. That you're putting that poor orphan boy in danger by refusing reasonable offers of help." Clara's jaw tightened. "He's poisoning the well." "Worse than that, he's building a case. If he can convince enough people you're unfit, he can have you declared incompetent. Take the ranch legally, claim he's protecting Noah's interests." Margaret leaned forward. "Clara, some people are listening. The men who owed Thomas money, the ones who never liked you, they're nodding along, saying maybe Hale has a point. And what do you say?" "I say a woman who survives 15 years married to Thomas Whitfield and comes out the other side running a ranch alone isn't unstable. She's stronger than most men I know." Margaret's expression softened. "But what I think doesn't matter much in a town where women can't vote or own property in their own names." Clara set down her coffee. her mind racing. Hale was smarter than she'd given him credit for. He wasn't just threatening violence. He was building a legal framework to steal everything while making himself look like a hero. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. "I heard Hale talking to his men yesterday. They were discussing the ranch's vulnerabilities, the barn roof, the well, the distance from town." She paused. "One of them mentioned fire, how dry wood burns even in winter if you use enough accelerant." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "He's going to burn us out." "I don't know for certain, but Clara, these men, they're not just hired hands. They're the kind of men who do what they're paid to do without asking questions. And Hale's paying well." Noah had climbed down from the loft, his face pale as he listened. Clara stood, moving to the window, staring out at the barn, the fences, the land she'd fought so hard to keep. "When?" she asked. "When do you think he'll move?" "Soon. Before that New Mexico investigation catches up with him. Before anyone can really look into his claims." Margaret stood, setting down her cup. "You need to leave, Clara. Take Noah and go somewhere safe. Let the law sort this out." "The law moves slow. By the time it catches up, there won't be anything left to sort out." "Then what will you do?" Clara turned from the window, her jaw set. "I'll fight, but not alone." She looked at Margaret. "How many people in town actually believe Hale's stories?" Margaret considered. "Maybe a third. Another third don't care either way. The rest—" She paused. "The rest are waiting to see which way the wind blows." "Then we need to change the wind's direction." Clara moved to the table, pulling out the documents she and Silas had compiled. The partnership agreement, the letter about water rights violations, the newspaper article about New Mexico. "Can you get these to people you trust? People who might actually read them?" "Clara, if Hale finds out I'm working against him, he won't. You're just a concerned citizen sharing information. Public service." Clara pressed the papers into Margaret's hands. "Please, you're right that I can't fight this alone. But maybe I don't have to." Margaret looked down at the documents, then back at Clara. Something shifted in her expression, a hardening, a decision made. "My husband was a lawyer before he died," she said quietly. "Taught me enough to recognize a fraudulent contract when I see one. And this partnership agreement," she tapped the paper, "has problems. The signatures don't match the notary seal date. The witness line is blank. This wouldn't hold up in any legitimate court." Hope flared in Clara's chest. "You're certain?" "Certain enough to stake my reputation on it, which is exactly what I'm going to do." Margaret tucked the papers into her coat. "I'll talk to Pastor Williams first. He's got influence, and he's never liked Hale's attitude. Then the newspaper editor, if I can catch him sober. By tomorrow morning, half the town will know Victor Hale's been trying to steal a widow's ranch with forged documents." "Margaret, I can't ask you to risk." "You're not asking, I'm offering." The older woman's expression was fierce. "I've watched too many women get pushed around by men with money and lawyers. Not this time. Not you." Clara felt her throat tighten. "Thank you." "Thank me by staying alive long enough for this to matter." Margaret moved toward the door, then paused. "That man staying in your barn, Silas Rourke. Sheriff Mercer says he's got a complicated past." "I know. Do you trust him?" Clara thought about Silas's steady hands rebuilding her fences, his gentle patience with Noah, the way he'd stepped forward without hesitation when she'd needed help. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then keep him close. You're going to need all the allies you can get." She left quickly, remounting her paint mare and heading back toward town at a careful trot. Clara watched until she disappeared, then turned to find Noah staring at her. "Are we really going to fight Mr. Hale?" the boy asked. "We really are." "What if he wins?" Clara knelt down, taking Noah's shoulders gently. "Then we'll have fought. And that matters. That matters more than you know." "I'm scared, Miss Clara." "Me too." She pulled him into a hug. But being scared and being brave aren't opposites. Sometimes they're the same thing. Silas returned an hour before sunset, and Clara knew immediately that something was wrong. His face was tight, his movements sharp with controlled anger. "What happened?" she asked as he dismounted. "Mercer got the documents from New Mexico." Silas handed her a bundle of official-looking papers. It's the same Hale, same tactics, same fraudulent contracts. They've issued a warrant for his arrest in New Mexico territory. All we need is for Colorado authorities to honor it. That's good news. It would be, except the territorial judge who'd have to sign off on the arrest is in Denver, won't be back for 2 weeks, and Hale knows he's running out of time. Clara's stomach dropped. How do you know he knows? Because I saw him in town. Saw the way he was moving, fast, decisive, like a man tying up loose ends. Silas met her eyes. He's not going to wait another week, Clara. He's going to move soon. Maybe tonight. Then we need to be ready. They spent the next hour preparing. Silas positioned buckets of water around the barn and cabin. If Hale's men tried to start fires, they'd at least have a fighting chance of putting them out. Clara loaded weapons and distributed them strategically. Noah was given one job. At the first sign of trouble, he was to climb out the loft window and run for the Hendersons' abandoned property a mile east. Hide there until someone came for him. The boy protested, but Clara was firm. You're the most important thing in this fight, she told him. More important than the land, the cabin, any of it. You stay safe, promise me. Noah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I promise. Night fell heavy and cold. Clara sat at the table, the rifle across her lap, watching the darkness beyond the windows. Silas was in the barn, keeping watch from there. They'd agreed on a signal. If either of them saw anything suspicious, they'd ring the old bell that hung outside the barn door. The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. Clara's eyes burned with fatigue, but she didn't dare sleep. Didn't dare let her guard down for even a moment. It was just past 2 in the morning when the bell rang. Clara was on her feet instantly, rifle raised, heart hammering. Through the window, she could see orange light flickering in the barn. Fire. Noah! She screamed. Go! Now! She heard scrambling from the loft, the scrape of the window opening. Then she was running for the door, bursting out into the frigid night air. The barn was ablaze, flames already climbing the walls, eating through the old dry wood with terrifying speed. Clara could hear the horses screaming inside, could smell burning hay and fear. Silas was trying to get the animals out, his silhouette visible against the flames as he led Juniper through the smoke. The mare was wild-eyed, fighting him, but he held firm, his voice low and steady as he coaxed her to safety. Clara ran to help, grabbing Ash's halter as Silas went back for Patience and the cows. The heat was intense, searing her face, making it hard to breathe. Smoke billowed in thick black clouds, choking and blinding. They got the animals out, all of them by some miracle, but the barn was lost. Clara stood watching it burn, tears streaming down her face from smoke and grief and rage. That's when she saw them. 3 figures on horseback, watching from the ridge about 200 yards away, watching their work, making sure it took. Clara raised her rifle, but Silas caught her arm. Too far, he said, his voice rough from smoke. You'll just waste ammunition. They burned my barn. I know. His grip was gentle but firm. But they're not done yet. He was right. Even as they watched, one of the riders peeled off, heading toward the cabin at a gallop. Clara's blood turned to ice. Noah! She ran, her legs pumped through the snow, her lungs burning, the rifle heavy in her hands. She could see the rider now, could see him dismount at the cabin, could see him kick in the door she'd locked behind her. Get away from there! She screamed. The man turned, and in the light from the burning barn, Clara saw his face, hard, scarred, empty of anything resembling mercy. He had a torch in one hand. He smiled and tossed it through the open door. Clara heard herself scream, a sound of pure anguish, and then she was firing. The shot went wide, but it made the man duck, made him run for his horse instead of waiting to watch the cabin burn. She didn't reload. She ran inside. Smoke was already filling the main room. The torch had landed on Thomas's old chair, and the dry fabric had caught immediately. Flames were spreading across the floor, up the walls, reaching for the loft. Noah! Clara choked on smoke, her eyes streaming. Noah, answer me! Silence. He'd gone out the window. He was safe. He had to be safe. But Clara's heart wouldn't stop pounding, wouldn't accept it until she saw him with her own eyes. Strong hands grabbed her from behind, pulling her back. Silas.
He's not here, Silas said, his voice urgent in her ear. You told him to run. He ran. Now we need to go before the roof comes down. My things, the documents. Not worth your life. Come on. He half carried, half dragged her out into the snow. They collapsed together 20 feet from the cabin, gasping for air, watching as the flames consumed her home. Everything she owned, every memory, every scrap of her past. Gone. Clara felt something break inside her chest, something fundamental and irreplaceable. She'd lost so much already. Her parents, her youth, 15 years to a loveless marriage. And now this. Now everything. I'm sorry, Silas said quietly. Clara, I'm so sorry. She couldn't speak, could only watch the flames dance and roar, destroying in minutes what had taken years to build. A sound made her turn, hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. Clara tensed, reaching for the rifle, ready to fight even if it was hopeless. But it wasn't Hale's men. It was Sheriff Cole Mercer, leading a group of riders from town. Margaret Chen was with them, and Pastor Williams, and a dozen others Clara recognized from Redemption Creek. Mercer dismounted quickly, taking in the burning buildings with a grim expression. We saw the fire from town, he said. Came as fast as we could. His eyes found Clara. Anyone hurt? Noah ran. I don't know where. I'm here. The boy's voice came from behind Margaret's horse. He slid down, running to Clara, throwing himself into her arms. I hid like you said. I hid and waited, and then I saw the sheriff coming, and I... Clara held him so tight she thought she might break him, tears streaming down her face. You're safe. Thank heaven, you're safe. Mercer was talking to Silas, getting the full story. Margaret had dismounted and stood beside Clara, her hand on her shoulder. Hale's gone too far this time, the sheriff said grimly. Arson's a hanging offense, and we've got witnesses. People saw his men riding this direction, saw them watching from the ridge. He looked at Clara. This ends tonight. I'm arresting Victor Hale and every man who rides for him. He'll lawyer his way out of it, Clara said bitterly. He always does. Not this time. Mercer pulled a document from his coat. Territorial Judge was early returning to Colorado Springs. I rode out there this afternoon, showed him the evidence from New Mexico. He signed the arrest warrant an hour ago. Victor Hale is wanted for fraud, intimidation, and now arson. He's done. Clara stared at the paper, hardly daring to believe it. It's over? The legal part, yes. But Clara, Mercer's expression was sympathetic. You've lost everything. The cabin, the barn. Even if Hale goes to prison, even if the ranch stays in your name, how will you rebuild? It was the question Clara had been trying not to think about. The answer was simple and devastating. She couldn't. Not alone. Not without money or resources or... She won't be alone, Silas said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He stood beside Clara, his face blackened with smoke, his clothes singed, his gray eyes steady. I'll help rebuild, he continued. I know construction. I'm strong. I can work. He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. If Clara will have me. Silas, you don't owe me. This isn't about owing. He turned to face her fully. I told you I was looking for a place to stop running, a place to build instead of destroy. I think... He stopped, then started again. I'd like that place to be here, with you, if you'll let me stay. Clara's throat was too tight to speak. She looked at this man who'd appeared in a blizzard, who'd fixed her fences and saved her animals and stood beside her when the world caught fire, who was offering her not just help, but partnership, not just his strength, but his future. I don't have anything to offer you, she said, her voice breaking. No home, no barn, nothing but debt and burned ground. You have yourself, Silas said simply. And Noah. And the most stubborn determination I've ever seen. That's enough. That's more than enough. Margaret was crying openly now. Pastor Williams cleared his throat several times. Even Sheriff Mercer looked away, suddenly fascinated by his horse's reins. Yes, Clara whispered. Then louder. Yes, stay. Please, stay. Silas's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He reached for her hand and Clara took it, feeling the calluses and scars and strength, feeling possibility. Well then, Mercer said gruffly, breaking the moment. First things first. We need to find Hale and his men before they make it to the territorial border. After that, he looked at the assembled townspeople. I expect this community can help these folks get back on their feet. That sound right? There was a chorus of agreement. Margaret was already making plans, talking about organizing housing and supplies. Pastor Williams mentioned the church had funds for emergencies. Others volunteered tools, labor, materials. Clara listened to them, these people she'd thought barely knew her name, and felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in her chest. Hope. Sheriff Mercer and his deputies rode out within the hour, heading for Hale's property with arrest warrants and righteous anger. The townspeople stayed behind, helping Clara and Silas gather what could be saved from the ruins. Not much, but something.
The lockbox with the important documents had survived, buried under rubble but intact. A few tools from the barn. Thomas's rifle, scorched but functional. By dawn, the fires had burned themselves out, leaving behind blackened skeletons and ash. Clara stood looking at the destruction, Noah pressed against her side, Silas's hand warm on her shoulder. We'll rebuild, Silas said quietly. Better than before. Stronger. How? With what money? The land's still here, the water rights. Once Hale's partnership agreement is voided, you'll own this ranch free and clear. We can take out a legitimate loan, hire help for spring. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having is. He smiled at that. No, it's not. Noah tugged on Clara's sleeve. Miss Clara, when we rebuild, can we make the barn bigger? Enough room for more horses? Clara looked down at the boy's soot-smudged face, his eyes bright with hope despite everything they'd just lost. She thought about telling him to be realistic, to understand the limitations they faced. Instead, she said, we'll make it twice as big, with a proper hayloft and everything. Noah grinned and Clara felt her heart expand. They spent the rest of that day at Margaret Chen's house, washing away smoke and soot, eating hot food, letting the exhaustion finally catch up with them. Noah fell asleep on the sofa before sundown, curled up like a much younger child. Clara and Silas sat at Margaret's kitchen table, drinking coffee, not talking much. There would be time for words later. For now, it was enough to simply sit together, alive and safe. When Margaret had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Clara finally spoke. Tell me about your past, she said. The real story, what you were running from. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Then, I was a hired gun, worked for a cattle baron in New Mexico who wanted land and didn't care how he got it. My job was to intimidate, to hurt, to make problems disappear. He stared into his coffee. I was good at it, too good. People saw me coming and they ran. Or they fought and He stopped. I told myself it was just work, just what I was paid to do. But that's a lie you can only tell yourself so long before you have to face the truth. What truth? That I was choosing it, every time, choosing violence over mercy, choosing fear over kindness. He looked up at her, until I couldn't anymore. Until I looked at myself and saw a monster. Clara studied his face, the scars, the pain, the genuine regret. What changed? There was a family, homesteaders who'd settled on land my employer wanted. He sent me to run them off, and I went, because that's what I did. But when I got there, his voice cracked slightly. It was a woman and her kids. Husband had died the year before. She was trying to survive on nothing but will and desperation. And when she looked at me, she didn't see a man. She saw a weapon pointed at everything she loved. What did you do? I left. Told my employer the land wasn't worth the trouble. He sent someone else, someone who didn't have my crisis of conscience. They burned the family out. The woman and one of the kids made it. The other two didn't. Silas's hands were shaking now. That blood is on my hands, Clara. I didn't pull the trigger, but I walked away when I could have stayed and protected them. Clara reached across the table, covering his hands with hers. You can't undo the past. I know, but I can choose better going forward. I can be the man who stays instead of leaving, who builds instead of destroying. He turned his hands over, gripping hers. If you'll let me try. I don't need you to be perfect, Clara said quietly. I just need you to be honest, and to stay when things get hard. I can do that. His gray eyes met hers, steady and sure. I want to do that. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, the promise settling between them like something solid and real. Tomorrow they would start rebuilding. Tomorrow they would face whatever came next. But tonight, they were simply two people who'd survived the fire. And that was enough. Word reached them 3 days later that Sheriff Mercer had caught up with Victor Hale 20 miles south of Redemption Creek, trying to cross into New Mexico territory with his men and a wagon full of documents he'd been attempting to destroy. There had been a brief standoff, shots fired, but no one killed. Hale was now sitting in the territorial prison in Colorado Springs, awaiting trial on multiple charges. His hired men had scattered like leaves in wind once their employer was in chains. Claire received the news standing in the ruins of her barn, a hammer in her hand and sawdust in her hair. She set down the tool carefully, closed her eyes, and let herself feel it. The relief, the vindication, the sheer weight of knowing the fight was finally over. "You all right?" Silas asked from where he was measuring timber. "I don't know yet." Claire opened her eyes, looking at him. "Ask me again in a week." He smiled, that warm, genuine expression she was learning to recognize. "Fair enough." The work of rebuilding consumed them. Margaret Chen had been true to her word. Within 2 days of the fire, half of Redemption Creek had descended on Clara's property with tools, materials, and determination. Pastor Williams organized work crews. The blacksmith donated nails and hardware. Women brought food enough to feed an army. Even people Clara barely knew showed up, rolling up their sleeves and asking where they were needed. It was humbling. More than that, it was transformative. Clara had spent so long believing she had to do everything alone, had to be strong enough to carry every burden without complaint or assistance. Thomas had taught her that asking for help was weakness, that needing people made you vulnerable. But watching her neighbors raise the frame of a new barn, listening to their laughter and conversation as they worked, feeling the community wrap around her like a blanket, Claire realized Thomas had been wrong about this too. Strength wasn't isolation. It was knowing when to accept the hands reaching toward you. Noah was everywhere at once, fetching tools, holding boards steady, asking 1,000 questions that the men answered with patience and humor. The boy had blossomed in the aftermath of the fire, his natural curiosity and energy no longer constrained by fear. He followed Silas like a shadow, learning everything the big man would teach him about construction and carpentry and the art of building something meant to last. "You're good with him," Clara said one evening, watching Silas show Noah how to properly drive a nail without bending it. "He's a good kid, smart, listens." Silas glanced at her. "You've done well by him." "I've tried, but he needs more than I can give him alone. Needs a—" She stopped, suddenly uncertain. "A father?" Silas finished quietly. Clara's breath caught. They hadn't talked about what came next, about what their agreement to rebuild together actually meant beyond the immediate work. But the question hung between them now, impossible to ignore. "Would that be something you'd want?" she asked carefully. "Not just staying to help rebuild, but staying, permanently, being part of—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing Noah, the property, herself. Silas set down his hammer, turning to face her fully. "I've been thinking about that, about what I said the night of the fire." He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "I meant it, Clara. All of it. I want to stay. Want to build a life here, with you and Noah. But I need you to understand what you'd be taking on. Your past. More than just the past. I'm not an easy man. I've got habits that won't change overnight. I wake up from nightmares sometimes, and I'm not always gentle about it. I don't talk much about my feelings because I'm not used to having feelings that matter to anyone, and there are probably people from my old life who'll come looking eventually, wanting to settle scores or call in debts." Clara moved closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his gray eyes. "You think those things scare me?" "They should." "Silas, I was married to a man who treated me like property for 15 years. A man who made me feel small and worthless and invisible. You could have every nightmare in the world,
wake up shouting every night, and you'd still be kinder than Thomas was on his best day. She reached up, touching his face gently. I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for real. And you're the most real man I've ever known. His hand came up to cover hers, his touch careful despite his size. I don't know how to be what you deserve. Then we'll figure it out together. That's what partnership means. Clara smiled slightly. You think I know how to do this? I've never had a real partnership in my life. We're both learning. Silas pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her in a way that felt protective without being possessive. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt something inside her finally settle. This was right. Imperfect and uncertain and complicated, but right. Miss Clara, Silas, come look! Noah's excited voice broke the moment. They turned to see him standing beside the barn frame, pointing at something in the distance. A wagon was approaching, loaded high with lumber and pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses. As it drew closer, Clara recognized the driver, Samuel Morrison, who owned the lumber mill in Colorado Springs. Heard you folks were rebuilding, Morrison called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. Figured you could use some quality timber. This here's white pine, properly seasoned. Should serve you well. Clara stared at the loaded wagon. Mr. Morrison, I can't afford... Didn't ask you to pay. He climbed down, brushing sawdust from his coat. Consider it an investment in the community. Besides, word's gotten around about what you did, standing up to Victor Hale. That took courage. Figure the least I can do is make sure you've got solid walls to stand behind. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything. Just build something worth building. Morrison tipped his hat to Silas. You the fellow helping her? I am. Good man. She needs somebody with sense. He glanced between them, something knowing in his expression. Both of you do, seems like. After Morrison left, Clara walked slowly around the wagon, running her hands over the smooth timber. Quality wood, expensive and carefully chosen. Given freely, no strings attached. Why are they doing this? She asked quietly. All of them. The whole town. Why do they care? Silas came to stand beside her. Maybe because you showed them it's possible to fight back, to stand up to the people with power and money and lawyers. You scared them at first, a woman alone, refusing to back down. But then you inspired them, made them remember that this land belongs to the people who work it, not the ones who just want to own it. I didn't do it to inspire anyone. I just did it because I was tired of running. That's why it matters. He smiled at her. Heroes who don't think they're heroes are the only kind worth having. The barn went up over the next 2 weeks, rising from ash and determination into something solid and real. It was bigger than the old one, as Noah had requested, with a proper hayloft and storage for winter feed. Silas built the stalls himself, working late into the evenings by lamplight, making sure every board was level and every joint was sound. Clara worked alongside him when she could, learning as she went. She'd never built anything before, had always been relegated to cooking and cleaning and other tasks Thomas deemed appropriate for women. But Silas taught her patiently how to read measurements, how to use a level, how to feel when something was right by the weight of it in your hands. You're a natural, he said one afternoon, watching her fit a board into place with perfect precision. I just like making something that'll last. Clara stepped back, admiring their work. Everything in my life before this felt temporary, like it could all disappear at any moment. But this, she laid her hand on the solid timber. This feels permanent. It is permanent. Silas moved to stand beside her, his shoulder touching hers. As permanent as anything in this world can be. The cabin came next. This time, Clara had input on the design. She wanted larger windows to let in more light, a real kitchen with counter space and storage, a separate bedroom for Noah on the ground floor so the boy wouldn't have to climb a ladder every night. And most importantly, a front porch wide enough for chairs where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the plains. Planning to do a lot of sitting? Silas asked, studying her sketches. Planning to have a life worth sitting still for. Clara looked at him. That sound all right to you? Sounds perfect. They poured the foundation in early March when the ground had thawed enough to dig. Pastor Williams came out to bless the work, and while Clara didn't put much stock in prayers, she appreciated the gesture.
The whole town showed up for the raising, and by sunset the frame was up, skeletal but promising against the darkening sky. That night, sitting around a bonfire with their neighbors, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: belonging. These people weren't just helping her rebuild a ranch. They were welcoming her into their community, accepting her as one of them, the widow who'd fought back, the woman who'd refused to break. "Speech!" someone called from across the fire. "Clara, say something!" She stood reluctantly, her cheeks flushing. "I'm not good at speeches." "Don't have to be good," Margaret Chen called. "Just has to be honest." Clara looked around the circle of faces, people who'd given time and materials and energy to help a woman most of them barely knew, people who'd chosen kindness over indifference. "3 months ago, I thought I was alone," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet night. "Thought I had to be strong enough to handle everything myself. But you all showed me I was wrong. Showed me that real strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to let people help. So thank you. For the barn, for the cabin, for—" her voice broke slightly. "For reminding me what community means." There was applause, and several people were wiping their eyes. Silas stood beside her, his hand finding hers, squeezing gently. "One more thing," Clara continued. "I couldn't have done any of this without Silas Rourke. He showed up in a blizzard, stayed through a fire, and helped me fight for what was mine. He's proven himself to be a good man and a true friend. And I'm hoping—" She looked at him, her heart pounding. "I'm hoping he'll agree to be my partner, in all things, for as long as he's willing." The gathered crowd went silent. Silas's eyes widened slightly, and Clara saw something vulnerable flash across his face. "Clara," he said quietly, "are you asking—" "I'm asking if you'll marry me." The words came out stronger than she'd expected. "I'm asking if you'll stay, not just for the rebuilding, but for everything that comes after. I'm asking if you'll help me turn this ranch into a home, if you'll be a father to Noah and a partner to me, if you'll—" She stopped, suddenly terrified she'd misread everything. "If that's something you'd want." For a long moment, Silas didn't speak. The firelight played across his face, illuminating the scars and the weathered skin and the gray eyes that had seen too much hardness. Then he smiled, and it transformed him completely. "Yes," he said simply, "to all of it. Yes." The crowd erupted in cheers. Noah came running from wherever he'd been playing, throwing himself at both of them with such force he nearly knocked them over. "You're staying?" the boy asked Silas, his eyes shining. "For real? Forever?" Silas knelt down to Noah's level, his big hands gentle on the boy's shoulders. "For real, for as long as you'll have me, if that's all right with you." "Can I call you Pa?" The question seemed to knock the breath out of Silas. Clara watched him struggle with emotion, his jaw working, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I'd be honored," Silas finally managed. "But Noah, you need to understand. I'm not trying to replace your father. He was your father, and nothing changes that." "I know." Noah's voice was small but certain. "But he's gone, and you're here, and you're good to Miss Clara, and you teach me things, and you don't get mad when I ask too many questions. That seems like what a pa should be." Silas pulled the boy into a hug, and Clara saw his shoulders shake slightly. When he stood, there were tears on his face that he didn't bother to hide. "Thank you," he said to Noah. Then to Clara, "Thank you both." Margaret Chen appeared at Clara's elbow, grinning widely. "Well, I suppose we need to plan a wedding now." "Nothing fancy," Clara said quickly. "Just simple, small." "In this town? After everything that's happened?" Margaret laughed. "Clara, dear, you're getting married whether you want one or not. Might as well accept it gracefully." The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a bright April morning when the plains were starting to green and the air smelled like rain and possibility. They held it outdoors, on the land Clara and Silas had fought to keep, with the new barn and the half-finished cabin standing as witnesses. Clara wore a simple dress that Margaret had sewn for her, cream-colored with blue embroidery along the collar and cuffs. Silas wore his best clothes, brushed clean and carefully pressed, his dark hair trimmed and his beard neatly groomed. He looked nervous and eager and completely out of his depth, which Clara found endearing. Noah stood between them, holding the rings they'd bought from the jeweler in Colorado Springs. Simple gold bands, nothing fancy, but solid and real. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony, his voice warm and genuine. He spoke about partnership and commitment, about choosing love every day, even when it was difficult, about building a life together through work and patience and grace. Clara barely heard him. She was too focused on Silas's face, on the way he was looking at her like she was something precious and impossible, like he couldn't quite believe this was real. She understood the feeling. "Do you, Clara Whitfield, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Pastor Williams asked. "I do." Her voice was steady. "And do you, Silas Rourke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was rough with emotion. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. Silas, you may kiss your bride." Silas cupped her face gently, his calloused hands warm against her skin. The kiss was soft and brief and perfect, and when they broke apart, Clara saw that half the gathered crowd was crying. The celebration afterward was exactly what Margaret had promised, the entire town showing up with food and music and enough noise to wake the dead. Someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing despite the muddy ground. Noah ran wild with the other children, his laughter carrying across the prairie. Clara danced with Silas, his arms careful around her, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. "You're good at this," she said. "My mother taught me. Said a man should know how to dance, even if he never gets the chance to use it." She sounds like she was wise. She was. Silas's expression grew distant. "She would have liked you. Would have said you had steel in your spine and fire in your heart. I would have liked to meet her." "Me too." He pulled Clara closer, "but I think she'd be happy knowing I ended up here. With you." They danced until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. The guests began to drift away, heading back to town, calling out congratulations and good wishes. Finally, it was just the three of them, Clara, Silas, and Noah, standing in front of their half-built cabin, watching the last light fade from the sky. "What happens now?" Noah asked. Clara looked at Silas, who looked back at her with a slight smile. "Now we finish building our home," Clara said, "and then we live in it." "That's it?" "That's everything." The cabin was completed by mid-May. Silas had built it with care and precision, making sure every window was level and every door hung true. Claire had insisted on helping with the interior work, learning how to plaster walls and lay floorboards. Together, they created something that was neither his nor hers, but theirs. The first night they slept in the new cabin, Clara lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds, the creak of fresh timber settling, the whisper of wind through new window frames, Silas's steady breathing beside her. "Can't sleep?" he murmured in the darkness. "Just listening. Everything sounds different." "Good different or bad different?" Clara considered. "Good different. Real different. Like this is actually mine. Ours." Silas rolled towards her, his hand finding hers under the blankets. "It is ours. All of it. The land, the buildings, the future. We built it together." "We did, didn't we?" Clara smiled in the darkness. "I never thought I'd have this. A real partnership. A real home." "Neither did I." His voice was soft. "I spent so long being the wrong thing, doing the wrong things, I'd given up on the idea that I could be anything else. But you looked at me and saw something worth saving. I saw a man trying to be better. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than we were yesterday." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, hands clasped, hearts beating in the quiet. "Silas?" Clara said eventually. "Yeah?" "Thank you for staying, for fighting, for choosing this life with me. Thank you for giving me a life worth choosing." Morning came soft and gentle, sunlight streaming through the east-facing window Clara had insisted on. She woke to the smell of coffee and found Silas already up, standing at the stove making breakfast while Noah set the table. This was her life now. This simple domestic scene, this warmth and light and partnership. It was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. The ranch thrived through the summer. With Silas's help, Clara expanded the livestock, buying cattle from neighboring ranches at fair prices. They hired 2 ranch hands, young men from town who needed work and were willing to learn. The ranch became profitable for the first time in Clara's memory, turning from a burden into an actual working operation. Sheriff Mercer stopped by occasionally with updates on Victor Hale's trial. The charges had multiplied: fraud, arson, conspiracy, intimidation. The evidence from New Mexico territory had been damning, and several of his former employees had turned witness against him in exchange for reduced sentences. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, Mercer told them on a warm June afternoon, sitting on the porch Clara had dreamed about. Maybe longer if they decide to try him in New Mexico, too. Good, Clara said simply. More than good. You did this, Clara. You and Silas. You stood up to him when no one else would. That matters. After the sheriff left, Clara sat on the porch watching the sun set over her land that was truly hers now, with no debts, no false partnerships, no shadows hanging over the deed. Silas came out and settled into the chair beside her, Noah following close behind. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn colors. You know what I realized today? Clara said eventually. What's that? I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy. I didn't think I'd ever be able to say that. Silas reached over, taking her hand. Me too. Noah leaned against Clara's other side. Me 3. They sat like that as darkness fell. 3 people who'd found each other in a blizzard and built something worth keeping. Not perfect, maybe. Not easy. But real. And lasting. And home. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, delivered by a young rider from town who looked apologetic about interrupting their breakfast. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and took the thin envelope, her stomach tightening with instinctive worry. Good news rarely came by telegram. Silas stood from the table, moving to her side as she unfolded the paper. Noah watched from his chair, a piece of toast forgotten in his hand. Clara read it once, then twice, her eyes not quite believing the words. What is it? Silas asked quietly. It's from a law firm in Denver. Clara's voice was distant, stunned. They're representing Victor Hale's estate. He died in prison 2 weeks ago. Heart failure. She looked up at Silas. He's dead. The words hung in the morning air, too large and strange to fully comprehend. Victor Hale, the man who'd tried to steal everything from her, who'd burned her home and threatened her life, was simply gone, ceased to exist, reduced to a telegram and a legal notice. Does it say anything else? Silas asked. Clara scanned the rest of the message. They want me to come to Denver. Something about his assets and outstanding legal matters. They need my testimony for the final settlement of his estate. When? As soon as possible. She set down the telegram, her hands trembling slightly. I don't understand. What could I possibly have to do with his estate? You were his victim. Maybe they need your statement for the record. Silas's expression was thoughtful. Or maybe there's compensation involved. Restitution for what he did. Clara hadn't considered that possibility. The idea of receiving anything from Victor Hale felt wrong, tainted, like accepting blood money. But Silas had a point. Legally, she might be entitled to damages. I don't want his money, she said. Maybe it's not about what you want. Maybe it's about what's right. Silas touched her shoulder gently. At least go to Denver and hear what they have to say. Then you can decide. Noah spoke up for the first time. Can I come? Clara looked at the boy, seeing the eagerness in his face. He'd never been to a city, had barely left Redemption Creek in his entire life. This would be an adventure for him. I don't see why not, she said slowly, if Silas can manage the ranch for a few days. The hands can handle things, Silas said, and I think Noah should see Denver, see something beyond these plains. He smiled at the boy. Every young man should know the world's bigger than his backyard. They left 2 days later, taking the stage from Redemption Creek to Colorado Springs, then the train north to Denver. Noah pressed his face to the window the entire journey, marveling at mountains and rivers and towns that grew progressively larger as they traveled. Clara watched him with a mixture of joy and melancholy, remembering her own first journey west,
how full of hope and naivety she'd been. That girl felt like a stranger now. Denver overwhelmed her senses, the noise, the crowds, the buildings that climbed 3 and 4 stories high. She'd forgotten what cities were like, how many people could exist in such compressed spaces, how the air tasted of coal smoke and ambition. The law office was located on Larimer Street, in a building that spoke of money and respectability. Clara and Noah climbed marble stairs to the 3rd floor, where a secretary ushered them into a wood-paneled office that smelled of leather and cigars. The lawyer was a man named Theodore Blackwell, thin and precise, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He stood when they entered, gesturing to chairs across from his imposing desk. "Mrs. Rourke, thank you for coming on such short notice." His voice was clipped, professional. "And this must be Noah Carter." "Yes." Clara settled into the chair, Noah beside her, both of them sitting stiffly in their best clothes. "Your telegram said this concerned Victor Hale's estate." "Indeed." Blackwell opened a file, shuffling papers with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Hale died intestate, without a will, which has complicated matters considerably. However, in the process of settling his debts and liquidating his assets, several irregularities came to light. Specifically, properties and funds obtained through fraudulent means." Clara's pulse quickened. "What kind of properties?" "Yours, for one. The ranch in Redemption Creek. Our investigation confirmed that his partnership agreement with your late husband was legally invalid, as was his claim to your water rights. Additionally, we've identified at least 12 other properties across Colorado and New Mexico territories that were acquired through similar fraudulent schemes." 12? Clara felt the number settle over her like a weight. 12 families destroyed, 12 homes stolen. What happens to those properties now? They revert to their rightful owners, where those owners can be identified and located. In cases where the original owners are deceased or cannot be found, the properties will be sold and the proceeds distributed among Hale's verified victims as restitution. Blackwell looked at her over his spectacles. "Which brings me to why you're here." He pulled out another document, sliding it across the desk. Clara picked it up, her eyes scanning the dense legal language. "In recognition of the damages you suffered, property destruction, mental anguish, legal fees, and loss of income, the estate is prepared to offer you a settlement of $8,000. Clara's breath stopped. $8,000. It was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. More than Thomas had earned in a decade of ranching. Enough to expand their operation, hire more help, secure their future for years to come. That's... She couldn't find words. "That's too much." "On the contrary, Mrs. Rourke, it's considerably less than the actual damages you sustained, but it's what the estate can afford after settling more pressing claims." Blackwell leaned back in his chair. "There's one condition, however." Clara's hope dimmed. There was always a condition. "Several of Hale's victims have requested that someone speak on their behalf at the final hearing. Someone who fought him and won. Someone who can articulate the full extent of his crimes." Blackwell's gaze was steady. "They've asked for you." "Me? Why me?" "Because you're the one who stopped him. You're the widow who refused to be intimidated, who gathered evidence, who stood her ground when most would have fled. Your story matters, Mrs. Rourke. It gives the others courage." Clara looked down at the settlement offer, at the number that could change everything. Then she thought about the 12 other families, the unknown victims who'd lost homes and livelihoods to Victor Hale's greed. "When is the hearing?" she asked. 3 weeks from today. Here in Denver. You'd need to testify before the territorial judge, describe what Hale did to you and how it affected your life." Blackwell paused. "I won't lie to you. It will be difficult. Reliving those events, speaking about them publicly. But it would help ensure that Hale's crimes are fully documented, that future victims have legal precedent to cite." Clara thought about the night of the fire, about watching her home burn while Hale's men watched from the ridge, thought about the fear in Noah's eyes, the weight of the rifle in her hands, the certainty that she was about to lose everything. Then she thought about Silas, about the life they'd built from ashes, about the strength that came from refusing to let cruelty have the final word. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll testify." Blackwell nodded, something like approval in his expression. "Good. I'll have the paperwork prepared. You'll receive half the settlement today.
The remainder after the hearing. They left the office an hour later, Clara carrying a bank draft for $4,000 and feeling like she was walking through a dream. Noah clutched her hand tightly, his eyes wide. "Miss Clara, are we rich now?" he asked. "We're comfortable," Clara corrected gently. "There's a difference. What will we do with all that money?" Clara considered. They could expand the cattle operation, buy better breeding stock, hire more permanent help. They could add on to the cabin, maybe build a separate house for the ranch hands. They could establish a real emergency fund, something to protect them from future disasters. Or they could do something else entirely. "I have an idea," she said slowly, "but I need to talk to Silas first." They stayed in Denver for 2 more days, letting Noah experience the city. They visited the state capitol building, walked through parks Clara had only read about, ate at a restaurant where the food came on china plates and the silverware gleamed. Noah absorbed it all with wonder, asking endless questions that Clara answered as best she could. On their last evening, as they sat in their hotel room watching the sunset over the distant mountains, Noah turned to her with unusual seriousness. "Miss Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When we go back home, can I start calling you Ma, like I call Silas Pa?" The question caught Clara completely off guard. She'd been so focused on building a stable home for Noah, on making sure he felt safe and cared for, that she hadn't let herself hope for this, hadn't dared to dream that the boy might actually want to claim her as family. "Noah, you don't have to." "I want to." His voice was firm, mature beyond his years. "You're not my real mother, I know that, but you've done everything a mother's supposed to do. You've kept me safe and fed me and taught me things, and—" He paused, his eyes bright. "You chose me. When you didn't have to. When it would have been easier to send me away. You chose to keep me." Clara pulled him into a hug, her throat too tight for words. This boy, who'd lost so much, who'd survived tragedy and displacement and fear, was offering her the greatest gift she could imagine. "Yes," she whispered. "You can call me Ma. I'd be honored." They held each other as the light faded from the sky, 2 people who'd found family in the aftermath of loss. The journey home felt shorter somehow, time compressed by anticipation. When the stage finally pulled into Redemption Creek, and Clara saw Silas waiting by the general store, his face lighting up at the sight of them, she felt her heart expand impossibly. This was home, not the land or the buildings, but these people, this love. Silas swept Noah up in a hug, then pulled Clara close, kissing her with an enthusiasm that made several townspeople whistle and laugh. Clara didn't care. Let them look. Let them see that the cold widow had thawed, that the woman who'd lived so long without affection had finally found it. "How was Denver?" Silas asked as they loaded their bags into the wagon. "Big, loud, overwhelming," Clara smiled. "And profitable." She told him about the settlement as they drove home, about the testimony she'd agreed to give, about the money currently deposited in a Denver bank under their names. Silas listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. $8,000, he said finally. "That's a fortune." "It is, which is why I want to use it carefully." Clara took a breath. "I have an idea, but I want to know what you think before I commit to anything." "I'm listening." "What if we didn't just use it for ourselves? What if we created something bigger?" The idea had been forming in her mind since leaving Blackwell's office, crystallizing with each mile of the journey home. A fund. For people in situations like I was in, widows, orphans, families facing foreclosure or fraud. Something to help them fight back, hire lawyers, keep their homes. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to look at her fully. "You want to give away the settlement money?" "Not all of it. We'd keep enough to secure our own future, expand the ranch properly. But the rest?" Clara met his gaze. Victor Hale spent years taking from people who couldn't defend themselves. What if we spent years giving back, helping people defend themselves? For a long moment, Silas was silent. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "You know that? Is that a yes?" "It's absolutely a yes." He took her hand. "We'll do it together. Build something that lasts longer than buildings or bank accounts. Build something that actually matters. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. They'd keep 3,000 for themselves, enough to buy breeding cattle, hire permanent help, and establish an emergency reserve. The remaining 5,000 would seed a fund administered by Pastor Williams and Margaret Chen, available to people facing legal troubles they couldn't afford to fight. They'd call it the Whitfield Rourke Justice Fund, a way of turning Clara's maiden name and her new name into something that helped instead of hurt. The 3 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of autumn work. The cattle needed to be moved to winter pastures. Hay had to be cut and stored. Fences required mending before the snow came. Clara and Silas worked alongside their hired hands, teaching Noah the rhythms of ranch life, the cycles of seasons and responsibility. In the evenings, Clara practiced her testimony, writing and rewriting her statement until the words felt true and strong. Silas listened patiently, offering suggestions, helping her find language that captured the reality without drowning in emotion. "You don't have to make it dramatic," he said one night. "Just tell the truth. That's powerful enough on its own." The morning they left for Denver again, the whole town seemed to turn out to see them off. Margaret Chen pressed a package of food into Clara's hands. Pastor Williams offered a brief blessing. Even Sheriff Mercer appeared, tipping his hat and wishing her luck. "You're doing a brave thing," the sheriff said quietly, "making sure Hale's crimes don't get forgotten." "I'm just telling my story," Clara replied. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing of all." The hearing was held in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and older justice. Clara sat in the witness chair, her hands folded in her lap, looking out at a room full of strangers and a judge who regarded her with careful neutrality. Theodore Blackwell stood to question her, his voice formal and precise. "Mrs. Rourke, please describe for the court your relationship with the deceased, Victor Hale." Clara took a breath and began to speak. She told them about finding the partnership agreement in Thomas's papers, about Hale's visit to her ranch, his threats against Noah, his calm certainty that he would win because the law favored men like him. She described the fire, the barn burning while his men watched, the cabin going up in flames while she fought to save what little she could. She spoke about the fear, not just of losing her property, but of being erased, of having her entire existence reduced to paperwork and legal claims, as if her years of work and struggle meant nothing. "Victor Hale didn't just try to steal my land," Clara said, her voice steady and clear. "He tried to steal my dignity, my autonomy, my right to exist as a person instead of as property to be transferred and sold. And he did it all while making himself look like a legitimate businessman, a pillar of the community." The judge leaned forward slightly. "What would you want the court to understand about men like Mr. Hale?" Clara met his gaze directly. "That they rely on our silence. They rely on victims being too scared or too ashamed or too exhausted to fight back. Every time someone speaks up, every time someone refuses to be intimidated, it makes it harder for the next Victor Hale to operate." She paused. "I'm not special. I'm not particularly brave. I'm just a woman who got tired of running. And if my story can help even one other person find the courage to stand their ground, then everything I went through will have mattered." The courtroom was absolutely silent when she finished. Then someone in the gallery began to clap. A single person, then two, then a dozen. The judge didn't stop them. He simply nodded at Clara, something like respect in his expression. "Thank you, Mrs. Rourke," he said quietly. "This court appreciates your testimony." Afterward, in the hallway, 3 women approached Clara nervously. They were Hale's other victims, she realized, women who'd lost property or husbands or homes to his schemes. They thanked her with tears in their eyes, holding her hands like she was something precious. "You gave us our voices back," one of them said. "We thought no one would ever listen, but you made them listen." Clara hugged each of them, feeling their pain and resilience echo her own. This, she realized, was why Blackwell had asked her to testify. Not for the legal record, though that mattered, but for this. For the moment when victims became witnesses, when silence became testimony, when individual suffering became collective strength. They returned home on a Friday evening, arriving just as the sun was setting over the plains. The ranch looked beautiful in the golden light, the barn solid and strong, the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, the fences stretching out across land that was truly, legally, indisputably theirs. Silas had prepared a celebration dinner, enlisting the ranch hands to help. The table was laden with roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from Margaret Chen's garden, and a pie that smelled of apples and cinnamon. "Welcome home," Silas said, pulling Clara into his arms. "How did it go?" "It was hard." Clara rested her head against his chest. "And necessary. And worth it." They ate together as a family, Clara, Silas, Noah, and the two ranch hands who'd become like extended family themselves. They talked and laughed and made plans for the coming winter. Noah regaled everyone with stories of Denver's wonders, only slightly exaggerated. Later, after everyone had gone to bed, Clara and Silas sat on the porch in the chairs they'd built together, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. "I've been thinking," Silas said quietly, "about the fund we're starting, about helping people fight back." "Having second thoughts?" "No, having bigger thoughts." He turned to look at her. "What if we did more than just provide legal help? What if we offered sanctuary, used part of our land to help people fleeing bad situations, gave them a safe place to land while they figured out their next steps?" Clara considered this, the idea taking root in her mind. They had the space, they had the resources now, and they knew better than anyone what it meant to need somewhere safe when the world was trying to crush you. "We'd need to build additional housing," she said slowly, "and have clear boundaries about how long people could stay, what we'd expect from them." "Agreed. But Clara, think about what we could do. Think about the lives we could change." She looked out over their land, seeing it with new eyes. Not just a ranch, but a refuge. Not just a home, but a haven. "Let's do it," she said. "Let's build something that lasts." Winter came gently that year, with snow that fell soft instead of violent. Clara and Silas spent the dark months planning their expanded operation, sketching designs for a bunkhouse that could shelter temporary residents, working out logistics with Pastor Williams and Margaret Chen about how to identify people who needed help. The Whitfield Rourke Justice Fund was officially established in January, with its first case a widow in Colorado Springs facing foreclosure due to fraudulent debt claims. The fund paid for a lawyer who successfully challenged the claims in court. The widow kept her home. Word spread quietly through the territory. A network of people who'd been helped began to help others, creating a chain of support and resistance against those who preyed on the vulnerable. Clara's ranch became a waypoint on an informal underground railroad of sorts, a place where people running from violence or fraud or desperation could rest, regroup, and plan their next move. Some stayed for weeks, others for months. They helped with ranch work in exchange for room and board, learned skills they could take with them, left stronger than they'd arrived. Noah flourished in this environment, learning from the diverse stream of people who passed through. He grew tall and strong, his cough long gone, his eyes bright with curiosity and confidence. Watching him interact with their guests, Clara marveled at his compassion and wisdom. "He's going to be someone special," Silas said one evening, watching Noah teach a young boy how to care for horses. "He already is," Clara replied. Spring arrived with its usual chaos of mud and new life. The cattle had survived the winter well, and several cows gave birth to healthy calves. The ranch was thriving financially, and the fund had helped 8 families retain their properties and dignity. It was on a warm May morning, exactly 2 years after Victor Hale's men had burned Clara's original barn, that Sheriff Mercer rode up with unexpected news. "There's someone in town asking after you," he said, looking uncertain. "Claims to have information about Silas's past." Clara felt Silas go rigid beside her. They'd known this might happen eventually, that someone from his old life might track him down, looking for revenge or payment for ancient debts. "What kind of someone?" Silas asked carefully. "Says her name is Rebecca Connolly, middle-aged woman, well-dressed, carrying legal documents." Mercer pulled an envelope from his coat. "She asked me to give you this." Silas took the envelope with visible reluctance. Inside was a letter written in elegant script. Clara read over his shoulder, her hand finding his as they absorbed the words together. The letter was from a lawyer representing the family Silas had failed to protect in New Mexico, the homesteaders who'd been burned out after he'd walked away. But it wasn't what Clara had feared. It wasn't an accusation or a demand for compensation. It was a thank you. The surviving mother and daughter had wanted him to know they didn't blame him for what happened, that they understood he'd tried to help by refusing the job, even if it hadn't been enough. More than that, they'd used the small settlement they'd received from Hale's estate to start over, and they wanted Silas to know they were safe now, thriving even. And they forgave him. Clara watched Silas read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. Then he folded it carefully and pressed it against his chest, as if he could absorb its words into his heart.
"They forgive me," he whispered. "After everything, they forgive me." "Because you deserve forgiveness," Clara said softly. "You've spent years trying to make amends. Years being better, that matters." Silas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. Clara held him while he cried, not from grief this time, but from relief, from the weight of guilt finally, mercifully lifting. Later that day, they rode into town to meet Rebecca Connolly, who turned out to be the mother herself. She was small and weathered, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. "I didn't come to cause trouble," she said to Silas. "I came to tell you that what happened to my family wasn't your fault. The men who did it made their choice. You made yours, and from what I hear, you've spent the years since trying to be the kind of man who protects instead of hurts." "I should have stayed," Silas said, his voice rough. "Should have fought harder." "Maybe. But you can't change the past, Mr. Rourke. You can only choose the present." Rebecca smiled slightly. "And it seems to me you've been choosing well." She stayed for dinner at the ranch, meeting Noah and hearing about the fund and the sanctuary work. Before she left, she pressed a small package into Clara's hands. "For your work," she said. "It's not much, but I wanted to contribute to what you're building. Wanted my pain to turn into something that helps others." Inside was $200 and a note that read, "In memory of those we've lost, in hope for those we can still save." Clara added it to the fund that night, recording Rebecca Connolly's name in their growing ledger of donors and supporters. Summer passed in a blur of work and growth. The ranch expanded again, with Clara and Silas purchasing adjacent land from a retiring neighbor. They built the bunkhouse they'd planned, creating space for 6 temporary residents at a time. The fund helped 15 more families that year, and word of their work spread throughout the territory. Clara's reputation grew too, though not in ways she'd expected. She became known not as the widow who'd fought back, but as the woman who'd turned her suffering into service. People sought her advice on legal matters, on dealing with unscrupulous land agents, on finding courage when everything felt hopeless. She and Silas made a formidable team, her strategic mind paired with his steady strength, her voice backed by his unwavering support. They became advocates, activists, quiet revolutionaries changing their corner of the world one family at a time. Noah turned 16 in October, tall and broad-shouldered like his adoptive father, with his birth mother's quick mind and Clara's fierce sense of justice. He'd become indispensable to the ranch operations, managing the temporary workers with compassion and competence. "What do you want to do with your life?" Clara asked him one evening as they worked together in the barn. Noah was quiet for a moment, carefully measuring grain. "I want to be a lawyer," he said finally. "Want to help people the way the fund does, but with actual legal knowledge behind it. Want to be the person who stands up in court for people who can't afford to stand up for themselves." Clara felt her heart swell with pride. "Then we'll make it happen, whatever it takes." And they did. The fund provided for Noah's education, sending him to law school in Denver when he turned 18. He came home during breaks, always eager to share what he was learning, to apply new knowledge to their work. The ranch continued to thrive. The fund grew. Lives were changed. And Clara finally understood what happiness meant. It was an October evening, 5 years after the fire, 5 years after Silas had promised to stay, when Clara stood on her porch watching the sun set over land that had witnessed so much pain and transformation. The cattle were healthy and numerous. The barn stood solid against the sky. The bunkhouse glowed with lamplight, sheltering 3 families currently in transition. Silas came out to join her, settling into his chair with a satisfied sigh. "Long day," he said. "Good day," Clara corrected. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped between their chairs, watching the sky turn colors. They'd learned to communicate in these silences, in the space between words where understanding lived. Do you ever regret it? Silas asked eventually. The fight with Hale? Everything that came after? Clara considered the question seriously. She thought about the fear and the loss, about watching her home burn, about the months of uncertainty and struggle. Then she thought about everything that had grown from those ashes, the fund that had helped dozens of families, the sanctuary that had sheltered countless people in need, the life she'd built with Silas and Noah, rooted in partnership and purpose. No, she said simply. Not for a second. A rider appeared on the horizon, probably someone seeking the fund's help, or a temporary resident arriving for shelter. Claire and Silas watched the figure approach, ready to extend the welcome they'd offered so many times before. This was their life now, this constant flow of need and response, struggle and support. It was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure. It was exactly what Clara had been searching for without knowing it. The rider drew closer and Clara stood to greet them, Silas rising beside her. They moved together naturally now, two halves of a whole, facing whatever came next the way they faced everything, together. The storm that had brought Silas to her door felt like a lifetime ago. That terrified widow aiming a rifle at a stranger, too afraid to trust, too hurt to hope. She felt like someone Clara had heard about, not someone she'd been. She'd been forged in that storm, refined by fire, tempered by struggle into something stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. And now, standing on her porch with her husband beside her, and their purpose clear before them, Clara Rourke finally understood the truth her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. Real strength wasn't about surviving alone. It was about building something that could weather any storm, not through isolation, but through connection, not through fear, but through love. The rider reached the gate, dismounting slowly. Clara stepped forward to meet them, her voice warm with welcome. "You're safe here," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Whatever you're running from, whatever you need, you're safe here." Because that's what they'd built from the ashes of that February fire. Not just a ranch or a fund or a sanctuary, but a promise that no one would have to face their storms alone, that kindness could be as powerful as cruelty, that ordinary people doing extraordinary things could change the world, one act of courage at a time. Clara Rourke had started as a woman with nothing but stubborn determination and a rifle. She'd become something far greater, a shelter in the storm, a light in the darkness, a voice for the voiceless. And as she welcomed another weary traveler into the warmth and safety of her home, Clara smiled, knowing that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Not surviving, not just enduring, but truly, finally, completely alive. Home.